Right. Good evening, everybody. We're very, very delighted to have Bob Archer here today to talk about the Rossing Uranium mine dispute in Namibia, where 3 years ago, when the Chinese National Uranium Company bought the mine, they immediately proceeded to sack all the shop stewards and tear up all the trade union agreements. So I'll say no more, but hand over to Bob, who knows a lot more about this than I do. So Bob, thank you very much for coming tonight, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to shamelessly exploit this to talk about the politics of Namibia and the situation in Namibia, because it's very difficult to understand what's happening, particularly at Rossing, without that context. I hope it won't be tiresome. At the end of the 19th century, Namibia was colonized by Imperial Germany, and there was a long struggle against that colonization, which led to various massacres and some victories. And at the end of the First World War, Namibia was turned into a mandate of South Africa. So it was run along the same lines as South Africa. And after the Second World War, apartheid was imposed in Namibia. And indeed, in the 1970s, it was the resistance of young people and workers in Namibia that kicked off the big struggle, the big revolt of the working class in South Africa against apartheid. Now, that struggle was mainly commandeered, monopolized by the Southwest Africa People's Organization, which was just one of a number of resistance movements, but they had the imprimatur from Moscow and from the United Nations, so they dominated the movement. That struggle of the 70s was repressed by the South Africans violently in old brutal ways, and a lot of the young people that had been involved in the uprising fled abroad to join the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. Now, what they discovered, rather than being given weapons and being able to fight against imperialism, they found that they were in fact led by quite corrupt leaders who used their position. They were the SWAPO was the official recognized opposition to apartheid. So they used that to feather their own nests and to often sacrifice fighters for their own particular purposes. And there were many examples of people who resisted this, they were met with this situation. They were horrified by it. And quite a few of these plan fighters were imprisoned in underground bunkers, dungeons, by the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. And there is a continuing fight by the parents and the families of the young people who were punished in that way, so many of whom died. The Parents Committee continues the fight for justice for them. In 1990, the United Nations and other guarantor states handed power over to the Southwest Africa People's Organization to run Namibia. It was allegedly a democratic takeover. There was allegedly an independent Namibia with a democratic constitution. But in fact, as the years went by, it became clear that that state was, first of all, thoroughly corrupt. Secondly, it was in the pocket of imperialist sponsors, particularly the European Union, the United States, and Scandinavia. I think Sweden is one of the guarantors. And it's particularly rested on an elite group in the Ovambo population. Now, it's a mining country. Most of Namibia's wealth is mineral, and the Tsumeb Copper Corporation was a big company. And at the end of the 1990s, there was a series of strikes by workers at Tsumeb Copper. And as a result, the company was closed down and the assets the assets now is a big problem. There was allegedly a big pension fund for the miners, but that disappeared. And it turned out subsequently it had been stolen between the Mine Workers Union of Namibia and various interests who had owned the copper works before. So there was a big struggle to try and get, and it's a struggle that continues because whole generations of Namibians rely on the pensions of the former copper workers. They live in their extended families. The next thing was the assets disappeared. I'll get back to that in a minute. The land in Tsumeb itself, then, amongst the assets of the former company, which were improperly distributed at liquidation. Liquidation is a legal process, and the assets of a company going into liquidation have to be distributed in a particular way with the people with an interest in the property first. But that wasn't done. And in fact, the government, in fact, the compound that had been formerly the workers' compound in Tsumeb, in the town of Tsumeb, ended up in the hands of a South African businessman who promptly started charging rents and rates of the tenants there and ramping up the rents. So there's been a long struggle, and it's continuing on the part of the tenants, the Tsumeb Copper Corporation tenants. The next thing that is worthy of attention is the other big natural riches in Namibia is the sea. They have very, very rich fisheries on the Atlantic coast. Now, they have to be carefully husbanded. There are very strict agreements entered into about the level of fishing, how much stock could be taken out, and the rights of workers. The fishery workers had very specific rights written into their jobs, how long they could be at sea, how long they had to have between shifts, how they could assure their safety at sea, and so forth. Now, it turned out that the companies were not holding to these agreements. And the first thing that people found out was that workers were not given their rights at sea. There was a whole series of health and safety and issues of working hours and so forth that led workers in 2015 to go on strike. And they were on strike for 3 or 4 years. Nobody ever heard about this, but it was a general strike of the fisheries that lasted several years. And then it became clear when these workers tried to take the legal route and get relief that they were through the courts, they were bamboozled and misguided by politicians, frankly, and they were left with nothing. And that's very characteristic of the way the Namibian state and the Namibian judiciary work. These workers were just left to one side and, in fact, organized around a football stadium in Swakopmund and kept going for years. Now, what really blew the lid off this was that it became clear that Icelandic and Japanese corporations had been illegally fishing. They'd been bribing ministers to get their companies access to fisheries and had overfished the area to the detriment, of course, of the stocks. Now, that was a major scandal. The fish rot scandal was a huge scandal. And it just gives you the nature of this government. So when we talk about Rossing was a uranium mine, which used to be owned by Rio Tinto, big mining corporation. And the workers there in the 1970s, in the 60s and 70s, organized a trade union in the face of apartheid. And it was a fantastic struggle. And it was helped particularly by international solidarity. The Liverpool dockers, for example, very demonstratively refused to handle yellow cake ore that was exported from Namibia. And the workers actually won very significant rights. They won recognition for the union. They won recognition for the roles of shop stewards and the branch committee of the union. They won health and other rights at work. It was a major victory. And that was the outcome of a very bitter struggle. It wasn't easy. Now, in 2014, it was reported that the China National Nuclear Corporation was buying the Rossing and I think all the uranium reserves in Namibia, and it would continue under their control. In the process, they guaranteed, and there were written guarantees and absolute promises, that trade union rights would be respected, working conditions would be respected, custom and practices on the job would continue as before. However, after purchase, the China National Nuclear Corporation started dismantling these rights. And they started, I mean, the first thing that people noticed was that Chinese employees started arriving in middle management, where there were perfectly competent Namibian workers to play the middle management roles. And there was a move really to populate the management with Chinese workers. And this rang some alarm bells. And at the same time, health cover was being reduced. And there were other things happening that made workers alarmed for their rights at the job. Now, at a certain point, as they started to organize a struggle against these attacks, the whole committee of the MUN, the Mine Workers Union of Namibia, at Rossing was sacked. First, the chair was sacked, and subsequently everybody else on the committee was sacked. So they they were obliged to well, they were in a fix. And one of the problems is that Mine Workers Union of Namibia is itself very hollowed out remnants of what the Mine Workers Union was that was built in the 1970s. And they didn't really get advice and support from the National Union. And once they were sacked, the workers had to work out on their own how they were going to oppose the sacking. So in the end, they went to the Labour Court and they applied for a ruling to get their jobs back. And the thing is that it's been played like a game of tennis. Every time they try to get a day in court, something comes up. The company says, no, we've still got, the company lawyer says we've still got things we've got to sort out. And the feeling strongly is that the Namibian government and the judicial system in Namibia isn't putting itself out to get justice for these workers. So they launched an appeal. The Workers' Advice Centre in Windhoek, which has been working on all the cases that I mentioned earlier, started to help and advise these workers, give them some legal advice, and they are still fighting the case in court. People, I think 12 members of the committee are, of course, unemployed, and we, for a while, that's a couple of us here in England and the Workers' Advice Centre in Windhoek, which is in the middle of, in the mainland of Namibia, were advising workers to set up a local branch of the Workers' Advice Centre and start to deal with the many cases. Everywhere there are employment cases and issues at work, which the unions frankly aren't picking up and sorting out. So we tried to support them in setting up a a workers' advice centre in on the coast at Swakopmund, and that's a bit faltering. It's not making much progress. So I'll just wind up by saying, well, what can we do? Well, the issue is that the workers' movement in Namibia needs to build itself. It's a leadership under construction. It would be very good, I think, to have some contacts here that are thinking about how we can support and solidarize with workers in Namibia. It would be very good if we could think about in the future setting up a solidarity network here, because I noticed from Carol's comment in the chat, she said, how did the workers survive for 3 or 4 years of a general strike? Well, they fell back on their families. They fell back on doing bits and pieces of work. In Namibia, unemployment is 40%. That's the percentage of the population that is unemployed is 40%. They survive somehow. It's not easy. We were able to, I mean, I'm secretary of a trades council, so we got some of these Rossing workers to speak to a trades council meeting on Zoom, as we are speaking now, and we got some support. We've got a colleague in the, a sister in the Unite the Union, and the Unite the Union London and Southeastern Region Solidarity Committee did send some help over, I think, to these miners, the sacked miners in Rossing. But I think the reason I wanted to raise this, that maybe not, there may not be anything we can do immediately, but we have to start thinking about how we re-establish international solidarity and links between workers in struggle. So stop there.